Just after midnight, I heard a man coughing upstairs. When I opened the guest room door, a stranger was sleeping in my late husband's bed, wearing one of my bathrobes. The next morning, my daughter claimed he was just staying temporarily. 3 days later, police officers knocked on my front door asking for his name. I still remember the way my stomach dropped when I saw him lying there under Harold's old quilt like he belonged in that room. The hallway light caught the gray in his beard and the bruises along his jaw. He smelled like cigarettes and sweat and something sour I couldn't place. My daughter, Melanie, came rushing up behind me barefoot in one of my old t-shirts. "Mom, please don't start," she whispered. "You're making this worse." Worse. That word sat in my chest all night. I'm 74 years old. I live alone in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in the same house my husband built with his own hands 40 years ago. I buried Harold 6 winters ago. Since then, every room in that house has stayed exactly the way he left it. His books still sit beside the bed. His reading glasses are still in the top drawer, and now some strange man was sleeping there. The next morning, Melanie acted like I was the unreasonable one. She stood in my kitchen pouring coffee while that man shuffled around upstairs in Harold's robe. "He just needs a few days," she said. "Who is he?" "A friend." "What kind of friend?" She slammed the spoon against the mug. "Why does everything have to turn into an interrogation with you?" I stared at her. My own daughter, 52 years old and still talking to me like an inconvenience. Then he came downstairs. Tall, thin, nervous eyes. He wouldn't look directly at me. "This is Curtis," Melanie muttered. He gave me a weak smile. "Ma'am." I noticed right away his hands were shaking. Not cold shaking, withdrawal shaking. I'd seen it before years ago when Harold's brother drank himself into the grave. Curtis sat at my kitchen table eating my toast like he'd been living there for months. Melanie kept touching his arm every few seconds, watching him constantly, protective in a way she'd never been protective of me. That hurt more than I expected. By the second day, things got stranger. Curtis never left the upstairs room with the curtains open. He jumped every time a car slowed outside. Twice I caught him peeking through the blinds toward the street. That evening, I finally asked Melanie the question she kept dodging. "Is he hiding from somebody?" Her face changed instantly. "No, you just lied to me." She looked exhausted suddenly. Older, angry, cornered. "You always assume the worst about people." "No," I said quietly. "Just the people you drag into my house." That's when Curtis exploded. He shoved his chair back so hard it hit the wall. "I told you this was a bad idea," he snapped at Melanie. "Your mother looks at me like I'm trash." I stood there frozen while my daughter defended him. Not me. Him. "Mom, apologize." I actually laughed because I thought she had to be joking. But she wasn't. The humiliation burned so deep I could barely breathe. 3 mornings later, someone pounded on my front door hard enough to rattle the glass. When I opened it, 2 police officers stood on my porch. One of them asked quietly, "Ma'am, is a man named Curtis Bell staying in this house?" And behind me upstairs, I heard a floorboard creak. The younger officer kept his hand resting near his belt, while the older one studied my face carefully. "We received a report connected to a stolen vehicle and possible fraud activity," he said. "We need to speak with Curtis Bell." My throat tightened. Behind me, I heard hurried movement upstairs, a drawer slamming shut. Footsteps. Melanie appeared in the hallway so fast she nearly slipped. "What's going on?" she asked too loudly. The officers looked past me toward her. Ma'am, does Curtis Bell live here? No, she answered immediately. He's just visiting. The younger officer exchanged a look with his partner. Not a good look either. The kind people give when they already know they're being lied to. Can we come inside? Melanie stepped forward before I could answer. Do you have a warrant? I turned and stared at her. My daughter hated confrontation her entire life. As a little girl, she used to cry if a cashier spoke too sharply to her. But suddenly she was standing in my hallway, acting like a criminal defense attorney. The older officer stayed calm. No warrant. We're simply asking questions. Curtis started coming downstairs. Slowly. I'll never forget the silence in that moment. His face had gone completely pale. His eyes darted toward the back door. The younger officer noticed. Curtis Bell? Curtis swallowed hard. Yeah. We need you to come with us for questioning. Melanie grabbed his arm instantly. He didn't do anything. Ma'am, the officer said firmly, please step aside. Curtis looked at me then. Really looked at me for the first time since entering my house. And what scared me wasn't anger. It was desperation. Like a trapped animal. I didn't hurt anybody, he muttered. The older officer nodded slowly. Then this will go easier if you cooperate. Melanie suddenly burst into tears. Not quiet tears either. Loud, shaking sobs that echoed through my hallway. You don't understand, she cried. He has nowhere to go. The officer's expression softened for maybe half a second. Then it hardened again. Ma'am, this man is connected to multiple complaints involving forged checks and identity theft. My knees nearly gave out. Identity theft. I looked upstairs toward my bedroom without meaning to. The officers noticed that too. Has Mr. Bell had access to your financial information? The older officer asked me carefully. Before I could answer, Melanie snapped at me. Don't say another word. I turned slowly toward her. That was the moment something inside me cracked. Not because of Curtis, because of her. My daughter looked more afraid of what I might say than what the police already knew. The younger officer asked Curtis to put his hands behind his back. Melanie lunged forward. Please don't handcuff him. Please. Neighbors had already started peeking through curtains across the street. Tulsa neighborhoods are quiet like that. People pretend not to watch while watching everything. Curtis looked ashamed now, sweating, breathing hard. Then the older officer asked the question that changed everything. Mrs. Whitmore, did your daughter ever ask you to sign any documents recently? The room went dead silent. I slowly looked toward Melanie. Her mascara had streaked halfway down her face. Mom, she whispered. And suddenly I remembered the bank envelope sitting unopened on my dining room table. The one Melanie kept insisting I sign when I had time. My hands started shaking because for the first time, I realized this man may not have been hiding in my house from the police. He may have been hiding there because of my daughter. Melanie wouldn't look at me. That frightened me more than the police standing in my living room. The older officer spoke gently, almost like he already knew how these situations usually ended. Mrs. Whitmore, we need an honest answer. I stared at my daughter. 2 weeks earlier, she'd shown up carrying grocery bags and acting sweeter than she had in years. She'd cooked dinner, cleaned my kitchen, sat beside me on the couch, holding my hand while we watched old game shows. At the time, I thought maybe she missed me. Now I understood. The envelope, the papers, the sudden affection. Oh my God, I whispered. Melanie's voice cracked. Mom, please. I walked straight past the officers into the dining room. The envelope was still there beneath a stack of mail. My name written across the front in her handwriting. Inside were forms from my bank, transfer authorization forms. I didn't fully understand all the language, but I understood enough. Joint account access, secondary authorization, power of attorney discussion paperwork. My vision blurred. "Mom," Melanie said behind me. I was going to explain everything. I turned around slowly. "You were going to steal from me." Curtis spoke up suddenly. "She said you agreed to help her." Melanie spun toward him in panic. "Shut up!" The younger officer immediately stepped between them. That's when I saw it clearly for the first time. Not romance, not loyalty, fear. Those two had been turning on each other long before the police arrived. The older officer asked if he could see the documents. I handed them over with trembling fingers. He scanned the pages, then looked directly at Melanie. "These signatures are blank." "I wasn't finished yet," she said quickly. "Finished with what?" She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. I felt sick. Not angry anymore. Sick. I kept remembering her as a little girl sitting at my kitchen counter eating cereal with her feet swinging under the chair. Harold used to call her our miracle baby because doctors said we'd never have children. And now here she stood in my house, beside a handcuffed man while police looked through paperwork connected to my bank accounts. Curtis suddenly started talking fast. She said her mom had money, said the house was paid off, said nobody checked on her much. Melanie's face twisted with rage. "Curtis!" But he kept going. "She told me if we could consolidate the accounts and get access to the property, we could get ahead for once." Every word hit me like a slap. We, not him. We. The older officer looked at me carefully again. "Ma'am, has any money gone missing?" I thought about it. Then my stomach dropped. 3 months earlier, there'd been a withdrawal from my savings account I didn't recognize. Melanie told me the bank probably made a mistake. She even offered to help me straighten it out. I never followed up because I trusted her. My knees buckled so suddenly I had to grab the edge of the table. The younger officer pulled out a chair for me, and that humiliation nearly destroyed me. A stranger treated me with more care in 5 seconds than my own daughter had in months. Melanie started crying again, but different this time, angrier. "You think I wanted this?" she shouted. "You think I planned my whole life to end up broke at 52? "Nobody made you steal," I said quietly. "You have no idea what it's like out there now." I stared at her in disbelief. "I worked double shifts for 20 years after your father died. That was different." "How?" She looked away, because she knew. The room stayed painfully quiet for a moment until the older officer finally said the words I'll never forget. "Mrs. Whitmore, I think you should contact your bank immediately." Then Curtis lowered his head and muttered something so quietly I almost didn't hear it. "There's more money missing than she knows about." And Melanie suddenly screamed at him, loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. Melanie's scream echoed through the house like something breaking apart. "You said you wouldn't tell them that." Curtis flinched backward, even with his hands cuffed behind him. The younger officer stepped in fast. "Ma'am, calm down." But Melanie had lost control completely. She pointed at Curtis with shaking hands. "You promised me this was temporary. You said we'd put the money back before she noticed." Every sound in the room seemed to disappear after that sentence. Even the officers went still. I sat frozen at the dining room table, staring at my daughter while my entire body turned cold. "How much?" I asked quietly. Nobody answered. "How much, Melanie?" Tears poured down her face now, but I couldn't feel sympathy anymore. Not after hearing her say we. Not after learning they'd already taken money. Finally, Curtis muttered, "Around 80,000. I honestly thought I misheard him. 80? My voice disappeared. Harold spent 30 years building that savings account. 30 years climbing telephone poles in Oklahoma heat and winter storms. He skipped vacations, worked weekends, ate bologna sandwiches at work so we could save money for retirement. $80,000 gone." Melanie dropped into a chair, sobbing. We were going to fix it. "How?" I whispered. She looked up at me with mascara streaked across her cheeks. "We had debts." "We?" She nodded weakly. Then the truth started spilling out piece by piece like poison finally surfacing. Credit cards, personal loans, a gambling problem Curtis supposedly had under control, missed mortgage payments on Melanie's condo in Dallas, collections notices, and somehow through all of it, my daughter kept smiling at family dinners, pretending her life was perfectly fine. The older officer asked for permission to sit down. I nodded numbly. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said carefully, "we need to determine whether these withdrawals were authorized or fraudulent." Melanie immediately grabbed my arm. "Mom, please." I looked at her hand touching me and suddenly remembered something awful. 2 months earlier, she'd insisted on driving me to the bank because she said I was too stressed to handle paperwork alone. I remembered signing forms I barely read because my eyes had been bothering me that week. I pulled my arm away slowly. "You used me?" "No, you used my trust." Her face collapsed. That's when the older officer asked another question. "Ma'am, do you currently have access to all your accounts?" I opened my mouth to answer and stopped. Because suddenly I wasn't sure. Panic flooded my chest. I hurried toward my downstairs office while everyone followed behind me. My hands shook so badly I could barely type the password into my laptop. When my bank account finally loaded, I felt physically sick. Several withdrawals, wire transfers, amounts just small enough not to trigger suspicion immediately. 5,000, 3,000, 12,000, over and over. My vision blurred so badly I couldn't read anymore. "Oh my God." Melanie started crying harder. "Mom, I was going to tell you." "When?" I snapped suddenly. "After I died?" That shut her up. The officers exchanged another look. Then the younger one quietly asked Curtis, "Where's the rest of the money now?" Curtis stared at the floor. Melanie looked terrified again. And in that moment, I realized something even worse. The money wasn't just gone. Neither of them knew where all of it had gone. Then my phone rang. The caller ID showed my bank, and the older officer said softly, "Mrs. Whitmore, you should answer that." My hands were trembling so badly I nearly dropped the phone. "Hello?" The woman from the bank sounded nervous immediately. "Mrs. Whitmore, this is Sandra from First National Security Services. We've been attempting to reach you regarding suspicious activity on your accounts." I looked straight at Melanie while she stood there crying in my office doorway. "What kind of suspicious activity?" "There were multiple failed attempts this morning to transfer ownership of your home into a newly formed limited liability company." The room spun. Even the officers looked shocked. "What?" Sandra continued carefully. "The documents were flagged because signatures on the electronic submission did not fully match our records. I couldn't breathe for a second. Transfer ownership. My house. Harold's house. The older officer slowly turned toward Melanie. You attempted to transfer the property? Melanie started shaking her head wildly. No, that wasn't supposed to happen yet. Yet. That word hit harder than anything else. Not no, not never. Yet. I sat down hard in my desk chair because my legs suddenly wouldn't hold me anymore. Sandra kept talking through the phone. Mrs. Whitmore, due to the attempted transfer and recent withdrawals, we've temporarily frozen all major account activity until we can verify authorization. Thank you, I whispered weakly. When the call ended, nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Curtis finally said the thing Melanie had been trying to hide from everyone. She wasn't just helping me. Melanie whipped around toward him. Stop talking. But he looked exhausted now, defeated. She started all of it. The room went dead quiet again. I stared at my daughter. Curtis swallowed hard. She found online groups teaching people how to move elderly parents' assets before probate. She said rich old people never notice until it's too late. Every word carved something out of me. She said the house would eventually belong to her anyway, he continued. Said you were stubborn and sentimental and wasting money living alone. Melanie lunged toward him, screaming. The younger officer grabbed her before she reached him. That's not how it happened. But Curtis kept going anyway. She told me about your passwords, your accounts, your routines. She even copied your house key months ago. I covered my mouth with my hand. Suddenly, all those little moments made sense. Melanie insisting on organizing my paperwork, asking strange questions about my will, taking photos during holidays for memories while angling her phone toward my office desk. The shame nearly crushed me. Not because I'd lost money, because I raised her. The older officer's voice turned firm now. Ma'am, based on what we're hearing, this may become a criminal fraud investigation. Melanie looked horrified. Mom, please don't do this. I stared at her for a very long time. Then quietly, I asked the question I should have asked months earlier. Did you ever love me? Or was I just your retirement plan? She burst into tears so violently she couldn't even answer. And somehow, that was answer enough. The officers began escorting Curtis toward the door first. Then the older officer paused beside me. We'll need a formal statement tonight if possible. I nodded numbly. Outside, red and blue lights flashed across my windows while neighbors stood pretending not to stare. Melanie suddenly turned back toward me one last time. Her face looked twisted now, angry, desperate, cornered. This is your fault too, she hissed. You always made me feel like nothing I did was ever enough. I felt something inside me finally go cold. Not angry, not heartbroken. Finished. Then the younger officer reached for Melanie's wrist gently and said, Ma'am, you're under arrest for financial exploitation and fraud. And my daughter started screaming my name as they led her out of my house. After they drove away, the house became so quiet I could hear the kitchen clock ticking from the hallway. I stood at the front window for a long time, watching the police lights disappear down my street. Then I locked the door, not because I was afraid someone would come in, because for the first time in my life, I understood danger could already be inside long before you noticed it. I barely slept that night. Every room in the house felt different now, polluted somehow. I walked upstairs around 2 a.m. and stood in the guest room doorway staring at Harold's bed. Curtis had slept there. My daughter had put him there. I opened the closet and found one of Harold's robes missing. That finally broke me. Not the money, not the arrest, the robe. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding one of Harold's old sweaters against my chest, and cried so hard my ribs hurt. The next morning, reporters were already calling. Neighbors suddenly wanted to check on me. Family members I hadn't heard from in years somehow knew everything by breakfast. Nobody asked how I felt. They asked how much money was gone. By afternoon, Melanie's mugshot was online. I wish I could say I didn't look at it, but I did. Over and over, she looked exhausted, hollow, angry, not sorry. The detective handling the case came by later that evening with more paperwork. He explained there would be hearings, financial tracing, possibly more charges depending on where the money ended up. Then he hesitated near the door. "There's one more thing you should know, Mrs. Whitmore." Something in his voice made my stomach tighten again. "We recovered messages between your daughter and Mr. Bell." I gripped the edge of the chair. "What kind of messages?" He looked uncomfortable suddenly. "There were discussions about moving you into assisted living faster if the financial transfers succeeded." My chest tightened painfully. "What does that mean?" He paused, then quietly said, "Your daughter believed once the house transferred, you wouldn't have much legal leverage left." I stared at him without blinking. He continued carefully. "There were also conversations about having doctors evaluate your mental fitness." The room tilted. All those months, the sudden concern, the sweet behavior, the questions about my memory, it had all been preparation. I felt 80 years old in that moment instead of 74. After he left, I walked through the house touching things. Harold's chair, the kitchen counter, the hallway wallpaper we argued over in 1987. I kept thinking the same terrible thought. If the bank hadn't flagged those papers, if the police hadn't come that day, how much longer before I lost everything? Near midnight, I heard something outside. A car door, then footsteps. Slow footsteps crossing my porch. My blood ran cold. I looked through the front curtains carefully. Melanie stood outside alone in the dark, her makeup smeared, hair tangled, coat hanging loose off one shoulder. I don't know how she got out so fast. She just stood there staring at the house. Then she looked directly at the window and softly. She smiled. Some stories end quietly, but the damage stays with people for years. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment below and subscribe for more real emotional stories like this one